with something that seems very obvious that will happen, but talk through the consequences, which is, what does retirement look like in a world where people are living significantly longer? And is this about prolonged middle age, or are we going to really see a period of prolonged retirement as well? Who'd like to start with that one?
Well,
Our mic's on, yeah.
So the observation I would make is the greatest year of, or the highest probability of mortality for men is the year after they retire. So in that respect, we should never retire.
Yeah.
We should work forever, because once we do, there's no more longevity, statistically.
Well, just a slightly more practical answer is that we're already running the experiment in a way. I'm sure it's been said here at some time this morning, but in the last 100, 150 years, we've come close to doubling life expectancy. When a lot of the programs like Social Security, Medicare, all of that were set up, nobody expected people to be living as long as they are now. So in fact, a lot of these speculative questions we're going to talk about here, we are already, in a sense, running the experiment. The interesting thing will be is if we have some kind of, if we're talking about these radical boosts happening, what will happen if we don't have the many years we've had to absorb, an increase in lifespan?
Yep. I'm sorry, so you don't have a mic, Paul? Okay, can we get 2 more mics up here, just on the stage? But feel free to pass it in the meantime.
Sure. So the retirement age of 65, great statistic. It was first set in 1934 for Americans. People are now living 50% longer in retirement than they were when the retirement age was first set at 65. So the retirement age of 65 is completely out of date. It's important to recognize that it was first set up as a safety net, and it's become an entitlement, because having people spend 19 years in retirement doesn't make financial sense.
Yep. Paul?
If we're asking the question, what will retirement look like in 20 years or so, I'm hoping it doesn't exist. I'm hoping that the R word, as I call it, can be banished from our vocabulary. There's incredible evidence that there is a wave of discontent, disinterest in that as a social norm. Some of the post-World War II kind of culture, the Del Webb moving to Sun City with a 9-hole golf course, a rec center, and a shuffleboard court waiting to die is not what people want anymore. And so the question is, how can we, and I think we can, change retirement norms, not just to enable continued work in the way we've worked for most of our lives, but transitional retirements, shared work arrangements, volunteerism, a whole series of other things that we know are not only better for our society, but better for our own health.
Mm-hmm. What does, one thing that I think about is philanthropy. So people, as they're living longer, presumably are going to save for longer. Are we going to see people less likely to give away wealth to communities, more likely? Older people give away a huge amount. What does this look like in the future? I guess the Milken Institute is an example, isn't it?
Well, so there is evidence that people aren't giving as much as they could. In some cases, that may be as a result of changes in kind of philanthropic tax opportunity that maybe only existed for foundations in the past. But I don't remember the exact data, but B of A, Merrill Lynch, and AgeWave came out with an interesting piece last year that talked about the combined value of actual cash philanthropy plus the value of human capital in contribution, volunteerism, again, charitable activity, and the number was absolutely massive. So if we can figure out a way to marshal both financial capital and human capital that exists in the baby boom generation and frankly in aging generations to come, we can do a lot to improve society, and not just our society, societies across the world that need the same thing, and that might have more political balance and happier, less divided countries if we could figure out a way to engage older people in productive, giving work to strengthen the next generation.
Absolutely.
Actually, I think that's really important because it's partly an answer to your last question, too. Even though there may be people that want to work longer, one of the things you think about as we move out here, I'm working on a big project on AI and health right now. And we have this counter movement of jobs. And we maybe saw that in the last election manifest itself here in the U.S. People need to have meaningful work. And maybe it does involve, and I've heard some interesting projects around engaging older people in more philanthropic activities. I mean, AI, autonomous machines are going to be replacing more and more of us, and they already have. And maybe that is a positive development that could be brought out of what might not look so positive.
Absolutely.
But this requires a complete change in the way we think about education. So education today is not necessarily preparing people across the board for productive work throughout their lives, even in youth. Youth underemployment is a huge demographic challenge and will add to the strain in our Social Security and other safety net systems. But when you think about people coming through an education system and hopefully being ready for work, if the working lifetime is now going to extend to 40 or 50 years in order to make retirement work and make retirement economically viable, then you have to change the way people engage with education. Lifetime learning, lifelong learning will be crucial to make sure that folks have the ability to adapt to a changing job market and their skills don't become irrelevant. And very many people today are retiring long before they want to because their skills are not relevant, because we're not engaging with lifetime learning in order to stay in the workforce for as long as people economically need to. And that'll be a major shift that's needed.
I just thought about the education piece. So this doesn't just require impetus initiative by individuals. It requires a change of institutions across society, which is why, if you really think about it, you realize that longevity changes everything. I was having a conversation with a pal of mine at Harvard. University opened its doors in 1636. Established a series of patterns and practices, which it still employs today. Took them about 200 years to get onto a common calendar among all the schools. And so average lifespans throughout almost all of history up until mid to late 19th century were in the range of 20 or 30 years. So it's logical that the universities focused on 17, 18-year-olds and maybe 23, 24, 25-year-olds and maybe glommed on a continuing education thing later on because somebody thought it was a good idea and a revenue producer. But why in the world shouldn't educational institutions across our society embrace people of all ages, enable comfortably people to be involved in academic programs? It's good for them because their financial model is already challenged. We know that millennials are having problems. And this could contribute in meaningful ways to society. But that's just one example of...
But what does the model look like? Is this, people showing up at Stanford to read the classics? Is this people logging on to take coding classes through Udacity online? Like, what will this model look like 15 years from now?
Well, I mean, look, whether it's online or on campus, a 50-year-old who shows up hypothetically to get a bachelor's degree at Stanford University should feel just as comfortable, just as challenged, just as embraced as an 18-year-old, and our institutions have to adapt to that. That means a change in faculty point of view. It means a change in the tenure process. It means a change in recruiting, in placement, and a whole series of other things. It's totally doable. It's just a question of rigid, backward-looking views by a whole series of institutions. Again, don't want to pick on universities, but it's just one place in society where this change has to occur.
Yep. Did you want to weigh in, David?
Well, I was just going to say, in fact, we have to do that. I mean, you know, the idea of retraining people, partly what I just mentioned. And I know a lot of really smart people who, you know, were great at being a doctor, but they wanted to also become a, you know, bioinformational person, you know. And they went back and got another degree, and then another degree. I think you did that. Thomas, did you?
Yeah, but I think but that's a high risk enterprise, right? And only people who feel like they have a safety net or feel like they can do that without failing and losing everything. So I think the shift that has to come is like have that be a acceptable and safe thing to do, not this exceptional thing that only the rare species can do.
Let's talk about end of life. How does living longer affect home care, mortality, trends like that, especially given that the end of life is lasting much longer? Thomas, do you want to go there first?
Sure. Well, yeah. So I right before I came here, I took one of those real age surveys. Has anybody done the real age survey? Really? Nobody's done the real age survey?
One.
It's this amazing boondoggle that it's a huge marketing suck, but it gives you you answer a whole bunch of questions, and then they give you what your biological age is, but then what your real age should be.
I'm apparently 38.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So we usually have a lot longer if you're doing it right. But the interesting thing was, so it predicted that I would live to be, according to as I answer these questions, 90. But for me the interesting thing was at 80. I was going to start getting sick, and I was going to have what is that, like 30-some years of good health, and then 10 years of illness, and that's a long time to actually have. You know, that's not exceptional, but to have it presented in such a black and white fashion that there's going to be, it doesn't matter. I mean, and public health has this worked out very well in terms of qualities and understanding what the quality of our lives is. But as we start moving the threshold further and further, we have to be aware, I think, of what is that quality that we're going to have towards that end. And so as we all then kind of get older and we, you know, have parents that move into nursing facilities or care facilities, and we understand how, in the worst case, how those years are not productive. People are alive. I mean, I think I've certainly been in nursing facilities where you feel like these are living mausoleums in some sense.
Well, a lot of bridge is being played, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that, to me, it's like we have to get better at caring for people in those facilities and thinking about how we design that experience so it is a rich and rewarding one.
But of course, the majority of people don't want to end up in one of those facilities. They want to stay in their home for forever, right?
I'll end up there.
So you don't think that we're going to become much better at designing home solutions for the elderly beyond the most affluent?
I hope so, but I also know that as you enter these, you have conversations with people whose parents have gone through the same thing, and there is no good solution. Nobody has, I have the answer. There is no such thing.
I think we need to be more deliberate about how we're innovative about it. And since people are going to have more time on their hands, they're actually going to live longer. But we should emphasize that if we increase healthy lifespan, which is what we're after here, most people, they'll live longer, but they'll still go through that end-of-life phase. I mean, ideally, I guess you have a great healthy life, you're 92, and you get hit by a truck. But that isn't going to happen with most people.
Yeah.
And I think as we're talking about the business of healthcare and innovation, we need to think about how to be, as Thomas said, much more creative about how we deal with that. But it's not fun.
Amy, and then Paul.
So the real question is whether we actually increase healthy life expectancy or whether we increase the period of disability. Because right now, on average, people are spending, say, 19 years in retirement, of which 14 are relatively healthy. These are broad averages, and 5 years have increasing degrees of disability. As we think about the health, nutrition, education shifts, socioeconomic and demographic shifts in our country, one of the things that is definitely going on is obesity, diabetes, poor nutrition, sedentary lifestyle will be having an impact on whether people are living longer in health or longer in disability, and how the healthy lifespan versus disabled period change over time will matter a great deal for our the economics of aging.
Don't we have a clear view on that at this point? Like, don't we know that people are living longer and less healthfully on average?
Yes.
Well, I think
For
there
poorer
are near-term effects where people are living longer and longer in disability. There are also longer-term effects. So we expect and would be surprised if there weren't medical improvements that affect how well people live and the quality of life with diabetes. We'd be surprised not to see people improve their nutrition over the longer term, even though in the near term and today, these things are having a very dramatic impact on healthy versus unhealthy life expectancy.
Yep. Paul, go ahead.
Well, so I think the tragedy of this is in many ways we know what to do. We really do. I mean, as important as advances in bioscience are, and they're really important, and they can achieve great things, fairly simple things. So we spend something less than 5% of our federal health budget on prevention and wellness. We did some finished research study recently concluded that we spend something north of $1 trillion a year as a result of U.S. obesity, which is a disaster. By the way, this is not just health cost. This is fully loading economic cost, productivity losses, absenteeism, presenteeism, et cetera. We know that somebody in the audience would know the exact data better than I do, with something on the order of 17–18% of U.S. adults still smoke. Probably no one in this room in San Francisco is included in that group. And by the way, we know that as much as we're experiencing longevity increases in audiences like this in San Francisco, in many parts of the country as a result of obesity, smoking, opioid abuse, suicide, gun violence, and various other things, we're experiencing actually less longevity. So we actually do know what to do if we have the will. We can embed smart policies at the federal, state, and local level. We can advocate for the right things. We can take actions that we know need to be taken. We just have to have will and be advocates.
Yep.
And that's really the question.
Amy, go ahead.
And if you overlay over the United States, if you look at maps of state by state obesity, diabetes, and education, and you overlay that with life expectancy, the negative correlation is incredibly strong. So we have regional patterns of increasing and decreasing longevity that are completely correlated with these health effects that, as has been said, we know what to do about this.
So somebody said to me recently that within the same city, a city in the United States, there was a 20-year, in two different zip codes, a 20-year difference in longevity. I mean, that's an extraordinary statistic, and it's tragic.
Yeah, David.
Yeah, and I want to throw out here too, as a former political reporter a long time ago, that this affects things, beyond some of the issues we're talking about. It affects politics. And we may have just seen, this is all about a group of people that are very angry. And I haven't really seen data on this, but I saw some information that suggested that some of the less healthy parts of the country voted for a certain candidate. And, there's some interesting correlations there. You have a group of people that, life expectancy is actually decreasing, as you said. And, you have drug addiction, et cetera, that's partly behind some of that. So these things don't exist in a vacuum, and I think as we're thinking about it in the future, politics is an interesting one. We can talk more about that if you want, but
yeah.
How that is impacted by especially one group that is living a lot longer and another group that's not.
Yeah, well, we certainly saw that in Britain too, with older voters deciding to vote for Brexit, and a division between young and old. Does anyone else want to think about the political consequences of longevity?
I'll just say I'm actually an optimist about this, surprisingly. I'm not so much an optimist about it when it relates to national policy. I mean, it remains to be seen where we head in the United States and in many countries around the world, but there are phenomenal local initiatives going on, not just in America, but across the world. And we had some people mention some of them before, but from Singapore to Seoul to New York City to LA, there are really interesting, innovative programs to embed questions about the impact on older adults across all of the agencies, across building and safety and recreation and parks and economic development and the like. So while dysfunction continues among the big boys, down at the ground where stuff actually happens, there's some really great stuff going on.
Okay.
But it's not likely to be affecting enough of the population in the sense that if you look at the least educated groups in the United States, folks without a high school diploma have seen their life expectancy decline by 4 years over the most recent decades, while people in higher socioeconomic groups with better education have seen very dramatic life expectancy gains. And the challenge is that we usually look at these statistics on an overall population basis, and we see longevity gains for the overall population, but we're missing that have and have not divide that is incredible to think that in the United States of America today, the least educated among us are living 4 years shorter than they would have been in, just a few decades ago.
And what you could see is something like, in a bad scenario, you could see something like Proposition 13, which here in California changed. People didn't want to pay high property taxes. Property taxes, of course, pay for schools. As the population ages, people may not want to pay for schools. They may not want to pay so much taxes when they don't have kids. So Proposition 13 goes state by state, and all of a sudden we've defunded our public education system. To me, that's a completely plausible but nightmare scenario. There are probably rosy scenarios that are one could extrapolate to an aging population, but they're not on top of my head. Right?
So go on that. Let's talk a little bit about social dynamics. So on my first panel, we talked about social robots and the issue of loneliness in retirees and older people. Curious your take on how widespread adoption will be of that, if you want to talk about robots, or just more generally, let's talk about social dynamics, isolation, loneliness, et cetera. How big of a problem will this be in the next decade or two?
Well, I think as we age longer, and again, we're already seeing this, you have more opportunities to have good things happen and more opportunities to have bad things happen. So if you go through a stretch of life where things aren't going so well, in the past that might have been short and then you were gone. I think you have, and that goes for everything, the good or bad that could happen to you. And we will all face ups and downs on all of that. And there's also interesting issues about who ages with you. Is it all your friends and family? We're talking here about these what if way out there scenarios. What if these life extension technologies are only available to a very small number of people, which they probably will be at first, and even people in your own family and friends can't afford it, or there's a lot of issues to think about if you're kind of hell-bent on radically extending lifespan.
Absolutely. Marriage, obviously, is a big institution that will be redefined in the coming decades as partners either outlive each other or there's more opportunities for things to go wrong and result in divorce, presumably.
Would you want to be married 15 times? I'm on my 16th marriage, really, it's my last one.
Or 90 years.
Yeah.
It's actually, by the way, when I talk to young people on college campuses about aging, and it tends to be kind of an interesting, conversation. How do you get them to realize that they're part of the process? Aging begins at birth, and it's going to affect their lives, life courses. But one of the ways you can hook them, at least in my experiences, is talking about this prospect of much longer relationships. So, half of them come from families of divorce these days, and you say, you better pick carefully because it could be 80, 90 years, and all of a sudden they start to listen to you.
Married people live longer. And when we think about not only the loneliness challenge, but also the challenge of care, married people care for each other. And so as our social fabric changes, if fewer and fewer people are married in retirement, then these challenges about care will go up. We also see statistics very plainly in our populations that once one spouse is deceased, the mortality rate for the surviving spouse is very, very high in the year after, especially if the surviving spouse is male. So how we address these socioeconomic and demographic changes if fewer people are married is a big deal.
So the good news is I'm married to a very healthy woman. Just one other point about kind of social networks and the isolation question. So demonstrably, we developed these robust networks particularly through school and work. And what happens is when work engagement declines, social networks decline, and people have less opportunity to have those contacts. So again, I think this is one of those opportunities, not just technologically, and sure, social networks present an opportunity, but in again, lifelong learning and faith institutions and a whole variety of activities that should be enabled, created, encouraged, become active norms. Again, volunteerism, which is so important and so valuable, not just for the beneficiaries, but for those doing the volunteering. So, if there's a piece of homework, I think all of us have if we get older, is not to let that creation of social networks, connections begin to winnow. It's bad for us.
Thomas and then Amy. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say. I think we are biological organisms. We are animals. Biology is chaos. But there's a great trick of the human brain, which is we tell our story or tell our lives as stories. Right? We love to tell stories, and we love to think of our lives as a narrative. It's not true. We're not actually living a novel, but we pretend, or we kind of conceive, we structure it as a story. And that's a really important part of these things like purpose and joy. And I think just thinking about your question about the technologies, thinking about how technology can help us share our story, help us continue our story, continue our sense of purpose. I think even things like Facebook can be great tools to letting people tell their stories. They also seem to correlate with higher rates of depression, so we have to watch out for that. But I think there are ways of thinking about how do we actually take these longer, like not thinking of it as extension, but actually keeping our story going, and thinking about ways that we can, if it's I never want to be in a relationship with a empathy bot. Sounds like a horrible thing. But if we come up with a better name for that, maybe those kind of tools can actually help us in that structure.
Absolutely. Amy, did you want to say something?
So the brain isn't meant to retire. The people who retire early have a higher incidence of dementia because their brain is not active, and then the body outlives the brain. And from a quality of life standpoint, it's not a good trend.
Okay. I want to open it up for questions. David, one more
really quick
word.
comment, which I actually wanted to thank the organizers here for having this panel. It seems a little out there maybe, but I think with all technologies, we have to think about these implications. And I think this has actually been fairly grounded here. And what happens to some of these things, why we're here talking about this, what if they happen in the short or medium term? And these are all really important questions we need to think a lot about.
Well, thank you. Please, questions from the audience. Would anyone like to weigh in, weigh out their scenario forward and get some comments from our speakers?
Just after lunch, we may have to cold call.
Okay, yes, here with the stripes. Oh, sorry, just right here, and thank you.
Hi, I'm Kristen McCullough with Startup, and I'm curious, how are we going to be funding all this work that we need to do to engage the elderly, whether it be socially or educating them or what have you?
Thank you. Will it be government?
Venture capital.
Yeah, there you go. There's a lot of it rushing around, I hear.
Well spoken from Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
Yes. No, I think in all seriousness that we need to come up with some formulas for this. As Thomas suggested and some others, there is more money being spent on the elderly, and they have more money. Maybe that accumulation of wealth, part of that can apply to paying for some of this, but it's clearly a huge issue. And when I was writing my book about longevity, and we were asking people why or why not they would want to live to 150, probably the biggest one after don't want to be old and frail was how do I pay for it?
So I would a couple things. One. In evaluating the benefit and burden of policy solutions, we have to fully load cost and benefit. We tend not to do that very, very well. We need to. That's number one, and we need to have a public conversation about priorities in America. What are we going to spend money on, and what's important to our future? And of course, again, aging being something that happens, that it's a human characteristic that we all share. Another thing, again, there is a private sector opportunity, and that is to think about, we're in the very early stages, the opportunity presented by this longevity economy, products, services, innovations for this growing population of older adults, and the power of older workers and intergenerational workforces, keeping people as taxpayers, consumers, et cetera, blowing up the dependency ratio, asking economists not just to be smart, but to be advocates for changing that notion and having people be as productive as they can be as long as they can be.
And then one thing we haven't touched on is a potential pensions crisis too, and who will come forward when we see systems go bankrupt. And so that ultimately might be the government. Amy, is that something that you've put thought into?
Yeah, absolutely. So the old age dependency ratio is a huge looming crisis. Before 1960, we had 6 people in the workforce for every retired person. Today, it's closer to 4 in the United States. Over the next several decades, it's headed for 3 people in the workforce supporting each retiree. In Germany, it's even worse. There will be 2 working people supporting each retiree. Which says a lot about what we need to change, because if you think about your children and your grandchildren having to support that many retired people, what it tells you is we can't have that many retired people, and that people need to change their whole retirement roadmap, and even the way we think about and plan for our lifetime financial needs. So financial wellness and lifetime, life cycle kinds of investing, saving, and planning will become the retirement roadmap for the future. Today, we save, plan, and invest for houses, for retirement, for paying off our student loans, for life insurance. Today, we do all those things separately. But in the future, if we're living longer lives, if we need to constantly re-educate ourselves in order to stay relevant in the workforce, if we need to make sure that we're not a burden to our grandchildren and our children, how we move through life with saving, investing, and planning will be entirely different. And the sooner we make this change, the more we'll avert a crisis, because the math does not work. There cannot be a future vibrant, thriving America in which there are 3 working people for everyone retired.
Let's take a couple more questions back to back. Esther, would you like to go? There's a microphone behind you.
So I'm really glad there's an insurance person here, because in a sense the math does work. And I'm curious whether you have any kind of policies that are based on, if you're healthy now, we will give you a lower premium, or because we've been talking about this all morning, that there's a really great return on prevention, but somehow we need a business model for it. And the obvious business model is insurance. Unfortunately, the average churn rate is way too low, but how's Prudential thinking about that? Sorry, it's too long.
Okay, and then let's take one other question and we can go back to back. Is there anyone else who had one? Okay, great. let's go for insurance.
So the very short answer is financial wellness and life cycle planning, so that your saving, investment, and insurance needs follow you through life and meet the needs that you have at any given point in time. It's a future thought, but it's one that people are actively working on and a problem that we aim to solve.
But as Strike, specifically, there are now at least a couple, for example, life companies that are basically saying skin in the game. We will create variable pricing based on a series of inputs, and you know what? If you stay thin and you're wearing your Fitbit and doing other things, not smoking, we will continue to monitor you, and you can control your own insurance cost. That along with a whole series of other things, genomic testing is going to, I think, completely reinvent at least the life part of the business.
There's also a couple moves afoot to counter how you're describing the insurance industry, and very tiny little steps, because they clearly are the key. They pay for things. But I'm beginning to hear about some moves towards prevention and keeping people healthy that are being driven by large corporations that insure themselves and want to keep their employees healthy. And they don't want to wait till they get sick. And there's been some interesting, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say who they are, but there are a couple in the Valley that have actually issued essentially a list of what they want to have covered, and they're a very large client in one case. And that's interesting that might be hopefully the tip of the spear here, where that, it makes some economic sense to actually shift that.
I'd like to wrap up really fast by asking you all to say because we've had a lot of depressing facts thrown at us. I'd like to bring a little upbeat end to our session. So I'd like to hear what you're most excited about that people are underestimating that comes from longer lifespans, besides like having more time to play bridge in a retirement home. Thomas, you start.
Oh, don't make me. I'm so good at pessimism. Well, I do. It's interesting how today, it's the business of longevity, but the way we kind of conflate longevity with healthcare, I think is we assume they are the same thing, kind of. So to me, I actually think what I am personally optimistic about it is just we get better about getting the effective therapies, the effective programs to the population, to the populations who can benefit them, and so we do start to actually move towards a more preventive system. I think, whatever happened with the ACA, I think the next wave, there's clearly an obligation now for the government to, there's 30 million people who would lose insurance if we took away the ACA. So that is a very real obligation to be on the hook to continue to drive these things and to continue to not just expect a very top level of the population to get the best care, but actually to distribute the burden. To me, it's going to take 5, 10, 15, 20 years, but I think that is where just deploying what we know works to the right people is going to be a big change in the next 20 years.
Okay, David.
Yeah, and I too am trained to be a skeptic as a journalist, and I deal in hopes and fears, and I think we've expressed a little bit of both here. I don't know, I go back and forth on balancing those two, but I think there is a scenario where we get parts of this right. And
That's the most cynical, optimistic comment I've ever heard.
Yeah, I know, it's funny. Anyway, but I think the idea here is to help us, I think, stay human and focus on those human things that are important to us. And in a technological society, in many ways, we've moved away from that. You were asking about loneliness, and we have a mental health crisis in the world right now. It's not just in the U.S. Hopefully, we can use some of these technologies to begin to think about that. But the key thing is we need to have people who are innovators, our smartest minds thinking about this. And it's not the sexy stuff like robots and AI and all that. I mean, it's partly that. But it's how do we deal with policy? How do we deal with some of these messier issues? Mm-hmm. And that's what I'm waiting to see. That's my hope anyway.
Okay, Paul.
So I'm going to be the unabashed optimist. I think we have a really good shot. We're in the first inning or two of changing culture, of really changing how we feel about aging, how we see it, addressing ageism, and employing older people and frankly people across the age spectrum in beneficial work, in volunteerism, in economic growth, the creation of new businesses, and in a lot of really productive activity. And again, I think we're in the very early stages. We could have looked back at any movement, at any group that was underutilized, underrecognized, whether it was based on race or gender or sexuality or any other characteristic, and we might have said at an earlier point that we were skeptical. But I see, to at least borrow HW's vocabulary, a lot of really interesting points of light, not just in America, but across the world for this. So I think things are going to get better.
Okay, Amy, really quick.
I'm optimistic about getting rid of the idea of a retirement age. We should be allowing people who are disabled to retire when it's appropriate for them and allowing others to work longer. I think this shift is already very much underway. If we get this right, it means that our brains will last as long as our bodies. People will be engaged in lifetime learning and keeping their skills relevant for 40 or 50 years in the workforce. And that will help impact the loneliness, the need for a community, and the stimulation that people need to be happy and whole.
Excellent. Well, on that very upbeat note, I will end. Thank you so much to my panelists. Please join me in thanking them. Thank you, guys.